Hey everybody, welcome back to the Wisdom Tradition podcast. This is Alex Sacken, and in today's episode, we're going to be continuing our analysis of the architecture of American governance. And so far in this series, we've been considering the idea that the American government is actually a three-tiered entity, and the lowest level is the overt government, and then behind that is what some people call the deep state, but which in my analysis has two levels to it. And the lower level of this deep state, so-called, is comprised of an oligarchy. And this oligarchy controls the networks of capitalist institutions that have gained control over the world economy. And so the American oligarchy oversees a world empire that has been for 70 years centered around the petrodollar, or the dollar as a reserve currency, and it's tied into global commodity markets. And the central control of these capitalist institutions by a network of banks and corporations, which are really organized as a cartel. This isn't a free market situation. The central control of the world economy through Americans' hands is done through a network of cartels that are ultimately protected by a global network of military bases and the forward projection of American power around the world to enforce this system. So this is the level I call oligarchy, and this is a global American-centered empire. This was something that we looked at in the first video, especially. In the second video, we introduced the idea that there's another level behind and within this capitalist situation, and that is the level of what I'm calling the technocratic superstate. And this is basically a scientific body that came into formation incrementally over the course of the 20th century. And this technocratic superstate exists in a concealed manner within the Black Projects world that is taking place deep within the military industrial complex of the US. So this military industrial complex is outwardly running this empire, but the proceeds from that empire really aren't, the full amount of them aren't going into the people who are running it. The majority of the funds are going into this Black Projects world, and this is being run by this technocratic superstate. And that's one of the reasons why this American empire has had to be kept secret. And so these three levels are all functioning at once. We have the outer democracy, we have capitalist institutions, and then we have this technocratic superstate. So one of the things I argued about this technocratic superstate is that it has three mandates. Number one, to produce a hidden portfolio of breakthrough technologies of the type that we discussed in the previous episode, including things like UFOs, or as they're called now, UAPs, and or breakthrough energy devices of various types. So that's one level. Number two is they need to install a security and information control grid to protect these technologies. But also this grid serves as the source of information flow into the think tank, and that allows them to formulate their governance models that they implement back down on the rest. And they do that through a governance strategy called regulatory governance. So basically they exert influence and control by manipulating the regulatory environment of the world. And they do this through the structure of U.S. empire, but they mold U.S. empire using this regulatory framework. So the global information control grid is both security in nature, but it also feeds their scientific models that they use to engineer the collective. So the approach to governance of the technocratic superstate is one of an engineering approach, because it's a scientific body. They approach governance as scientific management or social engineering. So that's the second mandate of this technocratic superstate. And then the third one is to use this architecture of information control and social engineering to bring about a global government, a new global system of government. And this will be used to gradually create a world order in which the breakthrough technologies it holds can finally be brought out. And I think it's in their idea that you have to have a very centrally, hierarchically controlled global system in order to safely implement these technologies, because they're so revolutionary that they're world changing, but also potentially world destroying in their power. And one feature of them that has to be appreciated is the fact that you don't need these rare things like enriched, plutonium or uranium or whatever to make the type of weapons that it's possible to make using this sort of classified science that the national security state is protecting. That once you know the ideas, potentially people in their garage can start creating things that have a lot of destructive capabilities. And so there is actually a good rationale for needing to keep protection and security around not only the technologies but the ideas themselves, the scientific ideas themselves. So what's interesting is that these technologies I'm describing are associated with the idea of an ether. So they draw energy out of the ether. This is something I'm going to be talking about in this video. And the ether is an idea that comes from alchemy. And alchemy was part of the esoteric knowledge that was always kept secret. And you had to be initiated in order to gain access to this knowledge. And so anciently, alchemical knowledge was treated this way. And in the modern age, the practical necessity of what they used to do has been rediscovered because the technologies that you can create using this alchemical knowledge of etheric energy are so transformative that it has to be protected in the same type of way that the mystery schools once implemented upon their initiates in order to gain access to the most prized knowledge. That the most prized knowledge of science is actually the same necessity to keep it secret and safe as there used to be with this tradition of esoteric knowledge. So it's actually one body of knowledge that's being worked with here. And in my opinion, it's these same mystery schools who are actually still the custodians of world events and still the protectors of this knowledge. And therefore, I think that they form another level that supersedes this technocratic superstate. So the ultimate fourth level is this realm of secret societies and the mystery schools. But that's something I'll get into later on. So in this episode, we're going to be continuing our analysis of this structure by analyzing the UFO issue and considering what the UFO issue tells us and what it reveals as we analyze it about this structure of American government. Because each level that I'm talking about, the outer public state, the capitalist oligarchy, sort of overt military structure, that tier, and then the technocratic superstate that I'm calling it, each of these reacts to this issue in a different way. So we'll be breaking down and analyzing the nuances of this issue and how it affects all these different levels. So typically when people first think about the UFO issue, they think about aliens. And so there's been a tight link. And this is one of the things I'm going to be analyzing in this video, is that the alien concept disguises the idea that UFOs are actually produced by a very human source, even though that source is operating according to a mode of thinking that is very alien to the majority of people. So in that aspect, it is alien, but it's alien in a human way. And what this disguises is the idea that from the beginning, the production of anti-gravity vehicles and UFO technology, we can track this issue back into the 19th century. And the 19th century, it was being run at the level of secret societies and secret networks. And that is the ultimate thing that nobody's looking at. So in today's episode, we're going to be analyzing all these issues, and we're going to do so by exploring a number of clips from people who I've cited in my long 11-part series on the secret history of the 20th century. And all these topics that we're discussing are discussed in great detail in that series. So we're going to be looking at all these things that we've been discussing in a variety of angles through these clips. So to begin with, I want to look at some clips that are going to discuss the existence of research into UFOs and the production of early prototypes of UFOs back in the 19th century. So first up, we're going to hear from Jason Reza Georgiani, and he's going to be overviewing this idea that in the 19th century there were these famous called flying airship sightings. He's going to talk a little bit about that. And then I'm going to switch over to a presentation by a guy named Walter Bosley, and he discusses in this presentation the existence of a network of secret societies investigating anti-gravity research and other types of breakthrough technology back in the mid-19th century, so before the Civil War era even. So he's going to be bringing things back to that early level and talking about how human groups, but at the level of secret societies, were orchestrating these technology programs and had built successful prototypes way back then. All right, without further ado, let's jump into it.
But it is shocking to hear accounts from Charles Delschow, who was a German American in Texas in the late 1800s, that he was working with a group of Prussian-backed aeronautical engineers in Sonora, California, to design airships, which were seen flying in Chile and in Venezuela in the beginning, I think, in the 1860s and through the 1880s. And then these airships were witnessed by many people in an 1896, 1897 flap in the southern United States, particularly in Texas. Right. Well, the accounts from the airship flap in 1897 are that, these guys would land on farms, and there were people. They were, human pilots dressed fairly normally, and they would ask to be resupplied certain basic goods that they needed, and in exchange, they would sometimes offer to take the farmers on rides with them. One Texan farmer was offered a ride to South America and back at an unbelievable speed.
All right, that was Jason Reza-Georgiani overviewing the idea that there was this 19th century program. And now Walter Bosley is going to go further into the earlier phase of that program that we know about. And this comes from Charles Delschow, who Georgiani referenced. And so Bosley is going to go deeper into his story.
Charles A. Delschow, German immigrant, born in Brandenburg, Prussia in 1830, died just over in Houston, Texas on the 20th of April, interesting date, 1923. Now, it is possible that he was sent to California to report back on the activities of this Sonora Aero Club. This is where it starts getting fun. There he is. There's Charles Delschow. He went to California in Tuolumne County, and he later in life wrote about this Sonora Aero Club, this group of German immigrants, there's a foot stopper, who were building all these secretive flying machines. So let's talk about them a little bit. As I said, a secretive group primarily of and led by German immigrants. There were a few Italians in there. And these guys designed, built, and flew, as I state, rudimentary contraptions. They called them arrows, and they flew them all around the countryside up there, just west of Yosemite. And this was in the 1850s. And this was all done under the aegis of this German organization, NIMSA. Okay, NIMSA was like they were the program office, as I said before. So they were the ones who were supplying certain resources and would watch the progress of these various groups. And we only know of the group in California through Delschow. But even Delschow refers to other groups in the US, and there could have been around the world. But in this particular case, we know about the Sonora Aero Club, meaning Sonora, California, of course, in the 1850s. This is an example of one of the arrows. Now, later in life, in the 1890s, Delschow started doing these drawings and paintings of these things. And he did several books of them. They've become kind of legendary. And at first glance, people say, they kind of chuckle a little bit, and they go, are you serious, really? What the heck? It's important to note that this dome shape here, okay, that's not a balloon. Okay, these are not balloons. Keep that in mind. Again, here's another one. This up here, these are not balloons. Okay. And again, these were the things that were being built in the 1850s and using a very interesting propulsion system. There's another one. Take a look at this one. Now, again, the 1850s. We're talking about anti-gravity in the 1850s, okay?
Okay, here I want to pause and point out this German connection and this idea that there was a central German command office, as he said, that had all these networks planted in America. And what's interesting is that this paradigm of having a central control office and various branches that are doing the sort of grunt work, this is the same structure I'm talking about with the technocratic superstate, how there's a central think tank and then there's a network of black projects of all types that it centrally orchestrates. And this model, it's interesting that he's tying in the German connection here, because we do know that a version of this did emerge in Nazi Germany within the SS during World War II, and it had the same exact structure. It was a network of black projects researching these kinds of things, these kinds of technologies during World War II in these underground bases, very secret, and it was orchestrated by a central command office called the Kammlerstab. Now, in my research into this issue, which I wrote an in-depth article on as part of my series on the 20th century, this German World War II era program, now this is notable here, it was starting from scratch. The work that was being done there was not picking up and building off of this previous 19th century program. So somehow this earlier program was somewhat concealed from the Germans. And the German SS was starting from scratch. So they were trying to build a workable anti-gravity vehicle. And if they had one, they would have tried to use it to turn the tides of the war. So in some mysterious way, there's something going on here where there was an earlier program. It did have connections in Germany, but it was based in America. This program went secret around the turn of the century. And I just want to pause and note that Tesla was also working on science and technologies along these same grounds. But anyway, around the turn of the century, this goes classified or goes dark or whatever, it disappears. And then over the early decades of the 20th century, we find emerging all of a sudden the structure of a U.S. imperial state. And gradually moves, very far-sighted moves, begin being implemented within some secret establishment within the U.S. in order to build out the architecture of a world cartel system. Later on, once these programs reemerge, as part of World War II, it's like they're starting from scratch and they're trying to reinvent the wheel. And so it looks like there's two tiers now. There's an original tier that's secret societies in the 19th century, and then in the 20th century, the second level, which is trying to reinvent the wheel, comes about. And meanwhile, there's this older legacy program that is explicitly in secret societies. So in my feeling that this older program is the top level of the technocratic superstate, so to speak. And now we have this structure where there's this global U.S. empire feeding this black projects world, and at the center is this technocratic superstate, but behind the technocratic superstate is this secret society entity. That's my grand sort of theory. And this whole story of what happened in the 19th century for me gives it away, tells me that this is what we have emerging here. Coming up next, Walter Bosley is going to talk about the technology trees that he can see a development in technology between the original 1850s technology that the Sonora Aero Club and Charles Delshaw was talking about. Decades later, we have this flying airship mystery where we see the technology evolving into a certain form. This is right around the time of Tesla. This is when the whole thing goes black, right around the turn of the century, it seems. And Tesla's involved in this. His relationship with JP Morgan is maybe the catalyst of this. But it seems like all these other projects that were involved with these flying airships were also consolidated into this one mega effort to centralize the whole thing, because these airships just stop after they came for like 2 years. That you see them floating around 1896, 1897, and then they just disappear. And then it doesn't reappear until the World War II era with the Foo Fighters, and then after World War II is when you really see the whole thing blow up. So that's what he's going to get into here, is the idea that what is being revealed here is a very human program that's iterating technologies as we go through the scientific age and the industrial age. And so let's check this out.
So let's look at technology. I put this up here to finally make it clear to you what I mean. I've been talking about, what's this 19th century technology, okay, and how does it connect to the 20th century? Well, here you have the 1850s Aero by Charles Delshaw, okay? This would be the equivalent of the Model T, right? A rudimentary proof of concept thing, all right? And then the 1890s airship, a little more sophisticated, but kind of like a 58 Buick, okay? Now compare the 58 Buick to the Model T, and you see the progression, okay? And then, of course, we have the famous, I guess that's the S4 model or whatever, and that's a 1985 Porsche. So you can see what I'm talking about here when I say the 19th century thread that connects this airship mystery to the modern technology pretty clearly, I think.
Okay, now we're going to move on to another clip from another source. This is going to be from Nick Cook, who is a researcher who wrote a really good book called The Hunt for Zero Point. And it goes all into the details of this German program that I'm talking about, this World War II era German program. And he focuses on the idea that it was brought over to the U.S. and harvested by the U.S. after the war and most likely replicated. Now, again, I think the way that when we hear his story, he's going to talk about how it appears that a number of anti-gravity breakthroughs were made in the mid-50s and then they disappeared. But let's remember that these breakthroughs that he's going to be talking about, that top scientists in these big defense corporations in America are trying to achieve, and it looks like they did achieve in the mid-50s, that these anti-gravity breakthroughs were already achieved in the 19th century because we have these very real examples of these flying airships. And they worked, and they were zipping all over the place, and they were carrying human occupants to and from South America at incredible speeds. And so we know that these breakthroughs had already been achieved, but the level of industrialism and technology had advanced by the mid-20th century, where the anti-gravity vehicles were looking different. They were looking like flying saucers. They were more highly engineered machines. But the core breakthrough, the anti-gravity breakthrough, the science behind that had already been cracked in the 19th century. And so now we're going to hear about how in the 20th century, the Americans seems to have cracked a certain level of this science. So this now disappears in the same way that around the turn of the century, this earlier program had disappeared. But let's hear from Nick Cook, and he's going to tell about his story about how he came to discover anti-gravity research and what he discovered that took place in the 1950s.
Back at the end of the 1980s, I was working for a magazine called Jane's Defence Weekly. We were just beginning to see the opening up of some very secret defence programs in America. Myself and a good many of my colleagues became fascinated by all these rumours of secret aircraft out in the southwestern desert of the United States being sighted, many of them being mistaken for UFOs. And I started to ask questions about these secret programs, and the more that happened, the more I realised that there was just so much out there that I wanted to know. Almost like manna from heaven, this gift literally dropped onto my desk. And on this particular morning, I think it was around 1990, 1991, I came into work, sat down at my desk, looked at my post, and there was this article. And the article was a photocopy from it looked like an old magazine, and it had a picture of something that looked pretty much like a UFO, a kind of cigar-shaped UFO with this sort of guy in a pilot's uniform, a military pilot's uniform, stepping down a ladder onto a desert lake bed. And underneath this picture it said, "The G engines are coming." And I thought, what the hell are G engines? And I was literally about to chuck this bit of paper in the bin when I read the first paragraph, and it started to talk about a whole bunch of aerospace companies that I was intimately familiar with investigating anti-gravity. Now, anti-gravity, a bit like UFOs, particularly if you worked in something as august as Jane's Defence Weekly, as I did, was something that you never ever talked about. It was a taboo science. It was culled straight from the pages of sort of tacky science fiction comics and books, as were UFOs themselves. So I started reading this first paragraph a little trepidatiously, but it mentioned all of these companies like Bell, like Lockheed, like Douglas, and one or two others. And knowing of these companies and their modern day equivalents, I thought, well, this is curious. So what on earth were these companies doing, supposedly investigating anti-gravity way back in the 1950s? This photocopied page being from an unidentified magazine at that point from 1956. And the way it was talking about this so-called anti-gravity revolution, it was really clear that these companies genuinely believed what they were saying, which was anti-gravity was around the corner, it was going to revolutionize the way we lived in, no more noisy jet engines, no more dirty propellers, it was going to be a brand new era, and we were all going to be flying around in little flying saucers like the Jetsons. And I thought, okay, so maybe there really is something to this. Maybe there really was a secret program or some kind of program going in the 1950s. And maybe there was some kind of a breakthrough. Maybe there was some technological breakthrough that got all of these guys talking about it in open forum in the mid-1950s. And at that point, the men in black stepped in and said, you're not going to talk about it, we're going to shut this down, and it now becomes totally secret.
Okay, so as we saw there, the US sort of deep state, invisible black projects world was definitely working on anti-gravity concepts in the 1950s. Now we know that Germans were also working on a program, a decade earlier, and that this program was eventually harvested by America. So it seems that there were multiple tiers to this American flying saucer program. Then there was also this whole 19th century program. This was the original one, and this was more on the level of secret societies. And it seems that the origin of the concepts and the pursuit of anti-gravity research and breakthrough technologies in the 19th century, it had nothing to do with the idea of aliens or reverse engineering alien technology. This is a meme that we see beginning after World War II. And that meme serves to cover up the Nazi program. It exists to cover up the 19th century program, and it also exists to cover up any related American program that existed at the time that needed to be kept secret. So all this stuff could be kept secret while people are looking at aliens. So the original 19th century program had nothing to do with any ideas about aliens, and it was actually focused on ether and alchemy and the attempt to manipulate the energetic substructure of material reality. And that's what anti-gravity vehicles are ultimately doing. And so in this upcoming batch of clips, we're going to be looking at the science of etheric energy and what it actually says, and how this science, which was very real back in the 19th century when these airships were going on, that this science explains how UFOs work. And the fact that these 19th century secret societies were working with these concepts, to me, these alchemical concepts tells me that this alien explanation for UFOs is a cover or a mask, a deliberately produced one that serves a valuable purpose, a social engineering purpose, and serves to mask a deeper level of projects that have to do with these mysteries of alchemy. So in these upcoming clips, we're going to hear about the nature of etheric energy, and we're going to hear from people like Tom Bearden and Jeffrey Mishlove and his interview with scientist Beverly Rubik. And this is from New Thinking Aloud. And we'll also hear a short segment from Jason Reza Georgiani, who's going to talk about how this whole science of ether physics seems to be tied into these earlier 19th century programs, and therefore is the real basis of this whole operation, this whole enterprise of breakthrough black projects world technologies.
Today, most scientists are unaware of the literature that the zero-point energy even exists, mainly because most scientists aren't physicists. Now, I went to school and I became getting a PhD in electrical engineering and systems engineering, and not one professor ever heard of it. And yet there it was in the library. So part of it is most scientists are specialists in their own area, and science today is very fragmented. Another resistance is the physics community, especially, that really know about this energy, realize if you could tap it, everything would change. The nature of physics would change. The most important foundation of all physics would then be the quantum energy that's embedded in space. And really, we don't understand it.
The guys trying to do it are looking at it as an open system. Now, fortunately today, we have a type of thermodynamics. Nobel Prizes have been issued for it, to Prigogine, for example, for systems not in thermodynamic equilibrium that do have. They're open systems, and the energy does flow in from outside and through them. Those kinds of systems can produce over-unity. It's all perfectly legitimate physics. What we mean is we are taking the energy from an external source and using it. So it's an open system, and the environment of the system is furnishing a flow of energy into the system, which the system is then collecting and using. Primary requirements: it has to be an open system, it has to have an external source of energy to furnish the energy that we're going to use.
So I want to pause here and know that this is Tom Bearden just talking, and he is basically giving out the idea that the ether, there's different names for it. Some people call it the vacuum or the 0-point field, but traditionally it's called the etheric field. And this etheric field is permeating throughout space, not outer space or terrestrial space, but space itself. And physical forms basically congeal out of this energetic field into form. So we know that that a material object or a life form, when you go look close enough, it's just energy in patterns. And so this structure of energy in patterns actually moves out into this etheric field, and it's the primary medium that is responsible for holding within itself all material structure, all space. So the Earth itself is congealed as a form with all the life in it within this universal field of etheric energy, and that field of etheric energy is the source that the universe and the structures in it, including the Earth, originally emerged out of, and that they will ultimately go back into. So the etheric field becomes the field of cause, and then the physical structures that emerge within this field emerge as effects of that cause. And in between this etheric field and the physical form are a variety of metaphysical levels. So there's sort of absolute space at the far spectrum. That's in philosophy associated with the idea of spirit. Then you have the body at the opposite end, and the body exists as like a negative receptive pole that the positive energy of absolute space is moving into. And then in between that is a variety of metaphysical layers. And these metaphysical layers are responsible for bringing the energy from cause down into the physical form of effect. And so that's, if you start to manipulate things at this level of metaphysical fields that interface with this etheric energy concept, that's how you can manipulate changes on the physical level. So the physical form exists as an open system, as he was just saying, and energy is moving into the system from this etheric field. And that's the basic idea. Now in this next clip, Beverly, Rubik, in discussion with Jeffrey Mishlove, they're both going to discuss the idea that the idea of ether that we're talking about is actually something that goes back to the ancient wisdom traditions and the philosophical teachings of antiquity. And these teachings used to be held within the body of the mystery schools. And so my thinking is that this modern form of the scientific enterprise that's interfacing with this field of etheric energy remains ultimately under the custodianship of these mystery schools. And this is the ultimate entity who is sort of driving world events. And they're using the technocratic superstate as the outer body. In the same way that back in an earlier era, the mystery schools in their modern form used the Masonic order. And before that, they used the Templars and the guild system. So they've always had an outer vehicle they've been moving into and working through. And so in the modern age, in the scientific industrial age, they're moving through this technocratic superstate entity. So let's hear what they have to say about the etheric field, i.e. the Akasha.
The concept of the ether, of course, it was very important in 19th century physics, but actually I suppose you could say it goes back to Aristotle.
It goes back to Aristotle, and it also goes back to the ancient world. It's in the Vedas, if we consider the concept of the Akasha.
To be equivalent to ether.
To be equivalent, yes. It's a way we would interpret that. which was the substrate really of giving rise to all of creation, together with a life force, the prana.
Yeah. The idea of the Akasha, of course, as I understand it, is that it contains the memory of everything that's ever happened anywhere.
Yes, the Akashic records.
Yeah. But Aristotle referred to the ether as the quintessential element.
Yes, Aristotle saw air, fire, earth, and water as changeable elements, but in his cosmology, the ether was also essential. It was kind of that which held the substrate of all those changeable elements and which itself was unchanging.
So one might think of that as equivalent to space.
Yes, today we would say the vacuum or so-called empty space. Of course, these conjure up absolutely nothing inside, but as it turns out, there is no really empty space.
Electromagnetic waves need to propagate through something, the way waves on the ocean propagate through water.
Exactly.
So the ether was postulated as the substance through which electromagnetic waves propagate.
Yes, and it makes sense. I mean, what is waving if you have nothing there? For example, sound doesn't travel through empty space without matter. And does electromagnetism need a substrate? Well, Faraday thought so. His whole theory of electromagnetism was based on the notion of an ether. We forget about that in modern science. We still use the laws of Maxwell, and that's our latest understanding of light and electromagnetism, but somehow we threw out the ether. But he embraced it. It was absolutely essential.
Well, as a student of esoteric culture, I'm very much aware of the fact that the Theosophists and many other esoteric organizations talk about etheric energy.
This drives everything that we call physical reality, from the quantum level right on up to the observed level and the observed world that we live in. Everything is energetically driven by the vacuum.
Which is interesting insofar as it connects to Tesla's idea that there is an ether. I mean, Tesla's world wireless system has been dismissed by many mainstream engineers because it's based on an alternative physics concept of a dynamic ether. And it may be that whoever was designing these airships was working based on the same alternative physics model.
So all of this stuff actually dates back a long time. We can establish a link between ancient secret societies and the mystery schools, up through these 19th century secret societies who were developing these concepts based around their researches into alchemy. And then we can track that through the 20th century, gradually up until the German program was formed. And this was then harvested back into America after the end of the war. And so we see this lineage. And then after World War II, a couple years after, we have Roswell. And then we have the beginning of this push to sell this alien idea. And to me, the push to sell the alien idea is something that's coming from the American program that was created in response to them incorporating and harvesting the German program. Because that is completely kept secret and off the agenda of this alien concept. So in these next couple clips, we're going to look at this idea that there has been a concerted effort within the military since the 40s to sell the idea of aliens in a deliberate fashion. And actually, it's this deeper aspect of the Black Projects world that's trying to sell this onto the more overt aspect or the outer aspect. So the outer aspect can be sort of controlled somewhat through this fictitious understanding of aliens, and they won't understand that there's a deeper aspect to this Black Projects world that is interfacing with the mysteries of alchemy. So for me, that's why this alien meme was created. It was created primarily to manipulate the outer elements of the U.S. national security state, particularly the ones that would also be involved with running the global empire. So the aspect of the U.S. national security state that's involved with running global empire is not necessarily the same as the very innermost depths of the U.S. national security state who's involved with these breakthrough secret technologies. So first up, we're going to hear from Annie Jacobsen, who is an author who's written on this issue. And she was on the Joe Rogan podcast several years ago, and she talked about something that a whistleblower told her at the end of his life, that he participated in the late 40s, early 50s in an effort to engineer what would look like aliens, but they're actually handicapped children, and that these would be seated in sort of deliberately crash flying saucers as a means to sell the alien concept, and to give some basis to the idea that all of this technology, this whole Black Project world is being put into place, that it was being developed in response to a so-called alien threat, and that the technologies it was developing were actually based on reverse engineering alien ideas. And this whole thing, I think, was put into place to conceal this deeper element that we were just talking about. So let's hear what she has to say about this project to sell the alien meme.
A lot of people want to believe that there were aliens in that craft. And my source, who I write about in the book, told me otherwise, that they were genetically, that they were...
Let me stop you right there, because when you say that craft, what you mean is the supposed UFO wreckage that crashed in Roswell, New Mexico in 1947. That's what you mean, right?
Yes.
But that was never supposedly taken to Area 51. It was supposed to be taken to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. The legend has it that Truman flew there to meet them, and right?
That's one legend.
Yeah.
So in my book, I interview a man who worked for the Atomic Energy Commission, who tells a different story. Tells the story of receiving that craft at Area 51, and that inside the craft were humans who had been altered, surgically altered to look like aliens.
Can I stop you there?
Yeah.
When you say humans that were surgically altered to look like aliens, do you mean things that turned out to be human?
Yes.
They looked like aliens, but they turned out to be humans that were manipulated surgically to look like aliens.
Yes, as a way to, and not remember, but where this was, very close to a nuclear weapons base, to our White Sands military base.
We altered people to make them look like aliens?
According to him, we had a small program.
So what'd they do, take prisoners or something? Like what? Who do they alter?
He said they were handicapped children.
Oh, Jesus. Was he saying that there have never been any encounters with alien spacecrafts?
He was totally neutral about aliens. He had nothing to do with aliens. He could have cared less. He didn't watch the X-Files.
And what was his take on Bob Lazar?
His take on Bob Lazar was that he probably saw something that the government had an extension of the program. I mean, he didn't know. That was speculative. We didn't talk about that. I mean, other than inference. He was very limited in the information that he would get out. But the Bob Lazar story is that when Bob Lazar said, I saw an alien, it looked like this, it was small, it had big eyes. Those were those were the surgically modified humans that the government was doing experiments on.
All right, so that was interesting. You can really follow a very deep rabbit hole going into ideas about what's fake and what's not. But if we just keep our eye on the idea that the reason for all that fakery is to conceal something that is true but needs to be disguised. And that's the existence of this whole Black Project world and the nature of the science that it's working on and the reasons that it has for wanting to engineer the outer society towards a system of world government. All that stuff is concealed through all these misinformation campaigns, or as I call them, worldview management perception campaigns. So now I want to just have one more example of this type of campaign being put into place. I want to revisit the idea that the alien concept is being sold as a type of deliberate campaign to mask these deeper truths. And here we're going to hear from Dr. Stephen Greer, and he's going to talk about how this whole situation is something that's deliberately engineered from some hidden hand.
This is real, that the UAPs, UFOs are real, but they're being used in deceptive indications and warnings, meaning false flag operations. But that's how they've been getting away with doing the abductions, the, quote, alien abduction hoax. The way they've been able to do it is have technologies and also creatures that look like they're gray or reptilian or whatever. I know men who've worked on them, actually fabricated them. Those are man-made. And they're used for their psychological warfare purpose. This is one thing I would love to get Dr. Jacques Vallée to release this document he has from 1985. It's a CIA official document, and it describes the CIA conducting abductions, alien abductions in Brazil and Argentina, quote, for their psychological warfare value. Now, what most people don't know about since late 50s, early 60s, like the Barney Hill case and all that, those were all human assets abducting innocent people made to look alien. And so that psychological warfare was authorized in 1953, 54. 1954, we mastered gravity control. So we started deploying these assets to begin to condition the public that there's a scary threat from outer space.
So what's revealed here are multiple levels and layers of deception and operations going on. And that just is a kind of case study for how this is likely the case for all these various situations going on in this black projects world. Because it's characterized by secrecy and compartmentalization, you can nest various levels of black projects inside each other. And so the outer levels don't know, and they've been misdirected away from understanding what the inner levels know and are aware of. And this way, a grand strategic campaign can be enacted with each level being positioned to play their particular part. Throughout all these different parts coming together, each on their separate level, a global transformation can be engineered into place. And I think that that's what's happening here. So now I want to move on and look at what some of the larger themes involved with a shift into a new paradigm of thinking surrounding etheric energy, and it's moving towards a unifying concept of life. We can see how this element of the ether integrates with a larger relationship between the divinity or the divine being and creation. These things all become now fundamental topics of interest. But what's interesting is that the need for secrecy and compartmentalization means that ultimate truth and reality has to be disguised away from and concealed behind a number of illusions. And these are deliberately created illusions in order to keep this environment of secrecy alive. Actually, almost every level of modern life and sort of materialistic science and the sort of worldview that we have in the world today is a falsely engineered system of constructs. You know, we have to accept the fact that we're living in a very deliberately manipulated and socially engineered environment that's designed to keep our attention away from the truths. Now, that situation right there is very archetypal, because if we consider back to one of the themes I've written about in my series a lot, this idea of the Kali Yuga and the descent of mankind into an age of materialism, and the idea that we're now moving into maybe a threshold of getting out of the Kali Yuga and moving on to a different phase of a larger cycle, that maybe things are culminating at this point, that we're on the threshold of globalization and a new paradigm of human governance and social order with these new technologies, that we're at the very cusp of that breakthrough. And so at this very last stage, all of this intense unresolved karma from the past is being brought forth and carried out. And it seems like this system that I'm describing is the means to bring about this karma, because it's essentially orchestrated agenda to keep mankind in ignorance, basically. And in that environment of ignorance, we, play out these stories of suffering and illusion, and these whole dramas that we all are playing out in our lives are all done in this context of being sold and accepting a false truth. So there's a deeper philosophical meaning to this whole idea of, why is this system in place? Why is all this happening? It seems like there's a deeper truth, and this starts to be discovered once you cross that threshold of changing away from a materialist paradigm and now looking at this etheric-based approach, because the ether-based approach is how we now enter into this idea that behind all diverse forms is a unifying field of life, and that this unifying field of life is actually a divine being manifesting into creation. The creation is actually it's like a meditation of this divine being, the consciousness, and the extension of one into many and back into one. So these are all things that come out in this paradigm that we're talking about, of this ether physics paradigm. So it's not only the source of technologies, it's also the source of a whole new concept of life and a whole new social order. And that was the end goal that the mystery schools and the philosophic societies of all ages have been working towards. So in this next clip, we're going to hear from Vandana Shiva, who is an author and activist I really like. And she's going to talk about how we're trapped in this psychology of differentiation. And because we're caught in it, we're not able to perceive the deeper underlying truth. And so the world order that we're in exists to falsely sell this idea of disunity. And so what we need to do is to be able to understand the idea that there is a unified field of causation behind all existence. So she's going to talk about that, and then we're going to go a little bit deeper into the mysteries of this ether paradigm.
The way you design the world in your mind is the way you relate to it in the real world. And when you design it as dead matter just to be exploited, you will exploit it. When you design it without any understanding of limits, you will violate the planetary limits. When you design it with deep recognition of interconnectedness, you will nurture those relationships. And this basic recognition is what I drew from my learnings in quantum theory, that non-locality, non-separation, interconnectedness, that is the nature of reality. But we have a design in the paradigm of mechanistic thought which didn't evolve, it was imposed. That mechanistic thought is based first on the assumption that we are separate from nature, and nature is constituted of discrete particles separate from each other who can only relate through violence, through force, through action by contact. In the quantum world, there is no separability. My thesis was on non-locality in quantum theory. Everything is interconnected. When you realize that the world is one interconnected whole, you also realize that what appears different is actually different expressions of an interconnected reality.
Okay, in this final set of clips, we're going to hear from Adam Trombly, who was an inventor of these type of breakthrough technologies using ether physics. He was a follower of Tesla's work. So he proved that this technology works, and he created a over-unity energy device, I guess as you might call it. And of course, it was confiscated and his lab work was shut down. So he was not able to continue with that by the so-called Men in Black. But he talks about some of the breakthroughs and understanding about the nature of reality that he encountered while designing and creating his device, and how it interfaces with these larger philosophical themes. So this is really the world that we are promised to move into as we discover this new paradigm of etheric physics, and this is what's possibly coming. But in order to get to this golden age, we have to get through this manifestation of the shadow, the collective shadow, and that is this whole empire of secrecy that has been set up. And this shadow entity, the circumstances that gave birth to it are ones that are deep rooted in our past. So it is a manifestation of collective karma. And when you consider the story arc that we're talking about of this sort of secret technocratic superstate and how it was set up to control these technologies, there's an aspect of inevitability about the whole thing. It seems as though it was sort of fated to happen the way it did. And so these are some of the themes that are brought up because there's this idea of a universal consciousness moving in to the universe, and that nothing happens by accident. It's all part of one deep evolutionary cycle within the world soul itself. So this is what is going to be discussed. So Adam Trombly is going to talk about it, and then I have one final clip by a scientist. I don't actually know his name, but he's going to talk about the new breakthrough philosophic ideas that are associated with this paradigm of etheric energy.
A modern-day inventor, Adam Trombly, was inspired by Tesla's work and by the possibilities of the torus. Trombly built a dynamo, a direct current generator that accessed electrical power right out of the air.
We were trying to demonstrate that by mimicking the magnetic field of a planet and rotating this device, we could actually create a dynamo that would work. And in fact, it did work, and it does work. So when we contemplate nature, when we contemplate Jupiter, or we contemplate a dynamo like the Earth rotating in space, we're basically talking about a magnet which is rotating in space. And the lines of flux of the magnet are pouring down and through in this toroidal pattern of the magnetic field. It's also expanding and contracting. It's breathing. It's taking in the energy of space literally and transforming it. Right here in this toroid, we have enough energy to transform the entire Earth. And that's not just a theoretical statement, it's literally true. To contemplate the implications of this means that every single place on Earth suddenly has power. Every single person on Earth suddenly has power. We have universal abundance. We can actually create the conditions whereby we're creating this breathing, taking in the energy of space, radiating out the energy of space, transforming the energy of space. Then we have enough power to commit miracles instead of just atrocities. Instead of destroying the Earth, we can heal the Earth. And each and every person, even without any technology, needs to realize that, most importantly of all, we must realize that we are the technology. We are the technology. We are the element that is absolutely necessary for this transformation to occur. We are the element that can actually use this, not just in terms of technology, but even in terms of our prayer. And I mean prayer in terms of, I mean it not in scientific materialistic terms only, but I mean in terms of the physics of prayer, the physics of spirit. Spirit isn't just something that's abstract, it is the context in which we appear. And this is where things have gone really haywire with scientific materialism. This isn't about evolution versus not evolution versus creationism. This is about understanding that we have a dynamic, very real and practical interface in all moments with this infinite power, with this infinite presence. And so what the atom and molecule, when we discover this kind of technology really works, in the process of discovering, we realize something about ourselves. We realize that, hey, we're not discrete entities. We're not like separated from space. We're actually seated in the midst of this context, and our context is infinite. Our context has no boundaries.
And now we're coming full circle and realizing that physics and metaphysics, that some of the notions of the 19th century, such as the ether and the vortex, are now being dusted off. And those ideas are being melded with modern experiments, plus quantum mechanics and so forth, into this magnificent synthesis of what I call sacred science, of a whole new science, a whole new physics in which consciousness reigns supreme, and where we don't have to follow any particular guru or a leader or anything like that, that we have everything we need in the universe. It's ours to have right now. And these are some of the basic essence principles that lie underneath the discovery of free energy.
All right, so that's powerful stuff. And this whole new paradigm is suggested. And the ideal for this new age that we can move into, one that will harmoniously integrate these four levels that are now functioning disharmoniously, and that's the outer society, this aristocracy / oligarchy level, this technocratic scientific superstate, and then finally the mystery schools and the secret societies at the heart of the situation. That in the ideal form, these will all be integrated together as one coherent structure, because that's how it was in the beginning. The sort of ideal of an old Atlantean golden age was the idea that there was a seamless integration between all of society's levels across the globe. And so the ideal is that is to be created once again. And this is going to be the new Atlantis. So that's what Francis Bacon wrote about as the ideal, the archetype for this phase of human evolution to move into. And his idea of an invisible college as being the culmination of the scientific age. So this was going to be a version of the mystery schools in which, its initiates were not only philosopher priests as in the days of old, but they were now also philosopher scientists. And they were the philosophic elect responsible for leading the world system. And just once more, all this material that I've discussed is talked about at length in both the chapter I recently put out, the 11-part series that was on the secret history of the 20th century, but also the previous material that I've discussed that links with that chapter. And that's all part of a book project called Philosophy, Its Origin, Purpose, and Destiny. And the table of contents for that is located on my website, www.alexsakin.com. And thank you very much for tuning in. God bless.